let's kind of dive into what we even mean when we say gut health, because you're right. A lot of my listeners are kind of waiting on this episode and knowing how important it is, but there will be some who maybe just know that gut health is a trendy term, but are not really sure what we're talking about and why. So tell us a little bit more.
No, it's such a good point. Like, really, what even is gut health? Like, what is our gut? What does it do? Right. So, really going back to the basics. So, essentially, our digestive system it's an open tube from our mouth to our anus. Right. We're consuming things from the outside world that then we have to break down, absorb, like, and build then to build us. Right. Like, we break them down into the smallest building blocks to then create us. Right. It's also a massive boundary. It's our boundary to the outside world. And so, being selective of what we're absorbing, what we're breaking down, what we're eating. And, we're not plants. We don't photosynthesize. So we actually have to consume food from the outside world. And that's the start of you, right? It's like what you are eating and what you are consuming. And, taking it one step further, it's not just what you're eating, it's what you're absorbing, right? Like, you're not just what you eat, you're what you absorb. So how is that barrier and is that sieve working properly, right? Are we allowing what we want to allow in? Are we keeping what we want to keep out? And it's all like from our mouth to our anus at every level, is every section of the digestive tract, because they all have different jobs. Are all of them working properly, and are they all working in concert with one another? And so gut health is, really just optimizing all of that. It's optimizing how we're digesting, it's optimizing enzyme function, and then it's optimizing absorption, and then optimizing elimination, right? It's like at every level, really supporting the gut at every level. And Hippocrates said many, many years ago that all disease begins in the gut, which also means on the flip side of that, all health begins in the gut, right? Because it's the foundations, it's the building blocks of us. So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about gut health is how are each of those sections of the digestive tract working? Are they to set you up to win or not, right?
And I see how important that is, certainly, because obviously you're saying the food we take in is what's creating us. It's giving us our energy, it's giving us everything we need to live. Fully agree with that. What I wanted to ask when you were saying that is, we can eat good foods all day long, and at the same time, it sounds like you're saying our body doesn't necessarily use them if the gut's not functioning properly. So there's kind of like more to it than just eating healthy. Is that fair to say?
Yes, totally. I mean, there's kind of two answers to that question. So first of all is, what is actually present in our food? Like, if we go down to like brass tacks of what we're actually digesting and what we're absorbing, we also have to step back and what's present in our food, right? So, a carrot's not a carrot, it's not a carrot. It actually matters what soil that carrot has been grown in. And if the soil is depleted, then that nutrient profile, those minerals, those vitamins in that said carrot, they're not going to be as many in that carrot if there were in this like really beautiful, rich, diverse soil, right? So that is rich in those minerals themselves, right? So even going back to into our food supply, right? Like our agriculture system. And then, talking about the insults to our gut, right? It's like the food that we're eating. If we're eating a diet that's really high in processed foods, or foods that will trigger that inflammatory response, we're putting a stress on the system, right? And if that system is stressed, it's not able to do its job as well as it would be if it wasn't stressed, right? So we can consume that carrot, but if our gut has been damaged for a multitude of reasons. I mean, going back to like whether you were a vaginal birth or a cesarean birth, right? It's like that is the initial population of your microbiome, right? So
Really?
yeah. So it's actually inoculated through through the birth canal, actually through
Wow.
vaginal microbiota essentially is the first inoculation of our gut. So going way, way, way back of just like how set up has your gut been from the very beginning? And that's no knock on cesarean birth or vaginal birth. It's just, the reality of the situation is that, your microbiome and the, how your gut has been set up may be different than, had you been vaginally birthed, and that may ultimately have an issue with, absorption, or how well you're digesting, or whether you're prone to bloating, or, all of the different symptoms that we can experience. And then looking at like medications and the chronic stress and like all the things that can impact our gut health, right? And when we have had these assaults on the system, it's not able to do its job as well, right? So we're not able to break down those foods as completely. We're not able to absorb them as well. We might end up with this thing called leaky gut, which we can kind of talk about and break down what that actually even means, because I think that's kind of a trendy term as well.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So okay, let me just repeat back,
Yeah.
just because I think maybe this will help everybody as well. There's kind of two pieces here. One is how much we can actually get from our food, which
Mhm.
I'm assuming that when we talk about how much we can get from our food in terms of nutrients, this is where we want to be finding organic as often as possible. Maybe it's local farming and things like that. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because I know that overuse of soil as well as conventional farming and all of that can deplete nutrients.
Mhm.
So that's one piece. We got to take in the good stuff. And
Yeah.
then you're saying we're also, I guess we could say it as taking in the bad stuff, which is
Mhm.
causing the problem. So processed foods, medications, chronic stress, and all of that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. Yes, exactly.
Okay. So that makes sense to me. 100%. You surprised me a little bit with the birth information. That's
Uh,
new learning. So I love to learn
yeah.
something new. So let's talk about what happens when the gut is kind of faced with all these inflammatory things like processed food and medications and chronic stress, because we can't avoid it, right? There's no way to avoid all of that. We all have to live our lives. We might have to take a medicine or whatever. So what is
Totally.
happening then?
Yeah, so there's, a couple different things that can occur. So when we're consuming things from the outside world that are inflammatory to the system, so 80% of our immune system, and that you may see like between like 70 and 90, that kind of depending on which study you're reading, but we'll call it an even 80. So 80% of your immune system actually lives in the gut, right? Which, going back to talking about what does the gut even do, that makes sense, right? Because we want to have a very clear filter of what we're allowing into our body, because essentially our digestive tract is open to the outside world. That's our filter. Thinking almost about it as a coffee filter, right? We want to be able to filter in the stuff that we need and that we can recognize, that we then use to build ourselves. So things like vitamins, things like minerals, things like amino acids, or like the building blocks of carbohydrates, fats, or proteins, right? And so, but then we also want to filter out the quote unquote bad stuff. So if there's pathogens, or if there's viruses, or if there's, anything that might be an assault on the system, we've got our front lines there and ready to go. So our immune system is housed in the gut for a really specific purpose, which is to protect you, right? Because we want to be very, very particular about what's coming into our bloodstream, right? Because that's
Yes.
a fast track to everywhere. So we want to make sure that we've got like a really good system in place to make sure that we're filtering correctly. Okay. So what can happen is that filter can get compromised. And that's where we run into some issues. So that essentially that filter, that compromised filter, is what we're talking about when we're talking about the term leaky gut.
Okay.
So our gut lining, like if you were to pull a hair from your head, like if you've ever had a split end, if you were to split that hair entirely in half, that half a hair is one cell thick. That's how thin our gut lining is.
Wow.
So it's a very, very thin lining that has a very, very big job, which is allowing the good stuff in and keeping the bad stuff out, right? Like that's its main goal. And so there are certain things that can disrupt that lining. That can be it almost acts as it's like an abrasion on that lining, right? So like if you're, Cheryl, you can see this, but if you were to like see, like if I put my hands together, underneath here would be your digestive tract. So this is the tube and this is your bloodstream, right? We want to make sure that we're filtering what comes in and what goes out. And that's basically our immune system. When we
Okay.
consume things like a diet rich in ultra processed food. And I really want to be also clear about this. Like, I'm not demonizing these foods. It's not that they're good or that they're bad. There's just also a reality of the physiology behind it, right? So a caveat is like, examine your relationship to these foods. I'm not demonizing them. I'm not saying you can never have them, but certain things like diets high in sugar, diets high in ultra processed foods, diets high in gluten or high in pesticides and herbicides, those can basically punch holes in that really thin lining. Okay. So now you have, like, say you eat a strawberry, and strawberries really shouldn't be an offense to the system. Like, our body should be able to totally digest that and be completely fine. But if that lining has been compromised and there have been holes punched in that, what happens is that now your immune system is interacting with parts of that strawberry that it never would have in the past if that filter was working correctly, right? So now you're getting this low grade chronic inflammation, right? And when we talk about inflammation is just the immune system at work, right? Like, if you sprain your ankle, you're going to get inflamed. It's going to become red, swollen, and that's on purpose, right? We want to send troops there. We want to go and rebuild and heal. So we need inflammation. Inflammation is a huge piece of the healing process. What happens is if you eat a donut once a month, your body can handle that. We're actually really resilient beings. Your body can totally handle that. So it comes in and the donut does its thing, and it's maybe not so nice and it's kind of abrasive on the system, but then our body mounts really beautiful immune response, and it mounts the inflammation response, and it comes in and it patches everything up and heals it. And then we go about our day. And then, the anti-inflammatory then comes in and finishes that cycle, right? So then we go back to quote unquote normal. The issue is that when we are experiencing that assault on the gut multiple times a day, every single day, right?
I
So if you
see.
wake up and you have, something for breakfast that's inflammatory, and then you're super stressed out about your job, and that's inflammatory to the system, because cortisol can actually be a part of that too. Cortisol being one of our primary stress hormones. It can be a part of, that assault on the gut lining as well. And then we have, Cheetos for a snack, and whatever. I'm not going to pick on food, but you get my point. It's like
Yes.
we're constantly on this inflammatory train, such that the healing system, that cycle, that inflammation to anti-inflammation, we can't ever close the loop. Okay. So then we have a gut that's been compromised, which means that we're not absorbing, we're not digesting, and we're not eliminating often the foods that, as completely as we would if we weren't riding that inflammation, right? It also means that those inflammatory compounds, right? Because our immune system is like there and ready and willing to fight. So it's just chronically being activated, which means that we have these inflammatory complexes, which are just part of the immune system, kind of bouncing around in the blood, because they're like, it's like always mounting the immune response, right? And so that causes inflammation in other places, right? That's how we can see how, maybe hormones are impacted by our gut health, or our joint pain might be impacted by our gut health, or our brain fog might be impacted by our gut health, because these immune complexes are being mounted all the time and are just kind of in the blood. So it's like your whole system becomes inflamed. Does that make sense?
It does. And you have described it in such a nice visual way. That helps me, and I'm sure it'll help others. I'm imagining, I think I'm imagining some sort of children's video with little bubbles of immune responses flying around in the blood, but that's helpful. I get it.
No, 100%. Actually, Panda and I always joke that we should do like a cartoon, like animated of the body. That would be perfect. But yes, that's exactly it. That's what's happening at a physiological level.